He kissed her right there in the office. Not quickly, not accidentally, but slowly, like a man who had never once thought about the woman waiting at home. Kang Min-jae, the most feared name in Seoul's criminal underworld, stood with his hands on Yoon Seo-ah's waist, laughing at something she whispered against his jaw. His secretary. His employee. The woman who sat outside his door every morning while his wife cooked breakfast alone. And Amara Brooks Kang stood frozen in the hallway, one hand pressed flat against the wall to keep herself upright, the other wrapped around a gift bag containing 2 tiny baby shoes and the first ultrasound of the child growing inside her body. She had come to tell him he was going to be a father. Instead, she learned exactly what kind of man she had married. If that were you, if you had carried that secret across the city, heartful, ready to change everything, and you walked through that door and saw that, what would you do? Would you scream? Would you drop to your knees? Or would you do what Amara did, press your mouth shut, pull the gift bag back into your purse, and walk away without making a single sound? This is her story. And it doesn't end in that hallway. If this is your first time here, subscribe and stay until the last second, because this story is going to take you somewhere you are not prepared for. Hit the like button. Drop your city and country in the comments right now. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. Amara had been awake since 4 in the morning, not because of the baby, though the nausea had been getting worse, a low rolling tide that climbed her throat every time she moved too fast. She was awake because she couldn't stop smiling. She had been planning this moment for 11 days. 11 days of hiding the ultrasound photo in the back of her underwear drawer, of deflecting Min-jae's questions about why she seemed quieter lately, of rehearsing the exact words she would say when she finally showed him. She had even bought a card. Plain white envelope, no cartoon animals or glitter. Min-jae hated excess. She wrote 3 sentences inside and then crossed them out and wrote 2 sentences instead and crossed those out too, and in the end she just left the envelope empty, because some things didn't need words. The gift bag was cream-colored with a dark ribbon. Inside, a pair of white baby shoes, size newborn, soft as cloth, with a single embroidered star on each toe. And underneath those shoes, sealed in a clear sleeve, the ultrasound. 8 weeks. A shape like a comma. A heartbeat the technician had let her listen to for almost a full minute before Amara had to press her hand over her mouth to keep from crying in the clinic. She'd told no one. Not her sister in Chicago, not her friend Jong-hye, not a single person. This belonged to Min-jae first. She dressed carefully. A dark green dress he'd once said made her look like herself, whatever that meant. She did her own hair because she always did her own hair, though sometimes Min-jae would stand in the doorway of the bathroom and watch her without saying anything, and those were some of the mornings she felt most like his wife rather than a guest in a well-furnished house. Their second anniversary. 2 years since a ceremony in a private room outside Seoul with 11 guests and a judge who mispronounced her name twice. 2 years since Min-jae had stood across from her looking almost nervous, which was the only time she had ever seen him look nervous, and had spoken his vows in that flat, controlled voice of his that somehow still cracked once at the end. She remembered thinking, this man is hard in ways I don't fully understand yet, but he chose me, and I'm going to choose him back every single day. She grabbed her purse, checked the gift bag one more time, stepped out into the morning. His headquarters occupied the 14th floor of a building in Gangnam that officially housed a consulting firm. The lobby had real marble floors and a security desk with 2 men who had never once smiled at her in 2 years. She was used to that. She was used to a lot of things about Min-jae's world that she hadn't expected when she'd agreed to marry him. She had known, going in, that he was not a regular businessman. She was not naive. Min-jae had been direct with her in the way he was direct about everything, not explaining more than he decided she needed to know, but not lying either. He had told her his business was complicated, that some of what he controlled happened outside normal channels, that the men around him followed a code older than the law. She had been 29 and living in Seoul for a graduate fellowship in international communications, and she had met him at a gallery opening she almost didn't attend. He had been standing alone in front of a painting, and she had made a comment about the brushwork because she genuinely could not stop herself, and he had turned and looked at her like she'd said something remarkable. They talked for 3 hours. He asked for her number before she had even decided she liked him. She gave it anyway. She understood what she was agreeing to. She told herself she did. What she had not fully understood was the silence, not the absence of noise. Min-jae's headquarters was not a loud place, but the silence that surrounded him like weather. The way people lowered their voices when he entered rooms. The way his own expression rarely gave her more than a sliver of what he actually felt. The way their apartment felt enormous some evenings, even when they were both in it. She had built her life around those slivers, a hand on her back when they walked into crowds. Coffee left on her nightstand before she woke. The crack in his voice at the end of his vows. She told herself those things meant something. She told herself they were enough. She stepped off the elevator on the 14th floor and nodded to the man at the reception desk, who nodded back without speaking. The hallway was long and carpeted and quiet. Through the glass walls she could see people at desks, not looking up. She knew this floor. She had visited before, always announced, always welcomed in a stiff professional way by Seo-ah, who managed Min-jae's calendar and his correspondence, and apparently much more than that. His office was at the end of the hall. The door was not fully closed. She heard his voice first, low, unhurried, the way he sounded when he was not performing authority for anyone. And then she heard laughter, not the controlled, obligatory laugh he offered in meetings, something lighter, private. She slowed. A woman's voice said something and he laughed again, and Amara's steps slowed further until she was barely moving, and then she was standing just outside the door with her hand half raised to knock, and the gap in the door was maybe 4 inches wide, and she looked through it because she was human and standing right there, and of course she looked. Min-jae was not at his desk. He was standing by the window, one hand resting on the glass, and Seo-ah was close to him, closer than any employee, any colleague, anyone with a purely professional reason to be standing that close. And while Amara watched, Min-jae reached out and put his hand against Seo-ah's jaw, tilted her face up, and kissed her. Not briefly, not ambiguously. Fully, slowly, like a man who had done this before. Like a man with no reason not to. Amara's hand was already on the doorframe. She felt the wood under her palm, and she pressed hard enough that she thought she might leave a mark. Seo-ah said something when the kiss ended, something low and amused, and Amara didn't catch the words, but she caught the tone. The ease, the familiarity, the tone of a woman who had long since stopped thinking of another woman as competition because the competition had already been decided. And then she heard her own name. Seo-ah said it lightly, the way you'd name something harmless. Amara Essie. With a small, almost fond smile in her voice, like a reference to something quaint. And what she said next came through clearly enough, that Amara was sweet, really, the way she was always home waiting, the way she had no idea, the way she believed the best about people. Min-jae made a sound, not quite a laugh, not exactly a dismissal, somewhere in between. The sound of a man who hears his wife described and does not reach for the defense of her. Amara stood in that hallway for 3 more seconds. She counted. She did not know why she counted, but she did. 1, 2, 3. Then she looked down at the gift bag in her hand, the cream ribbon, the tiny shoes sitting inside like a question she had spent 11 days working up to asking. She folded the top of the bag closed, tucked it under her arm, and then into her purse, slowly, making no sound. She straightened. She walked back down the carpeted hallway toward the elevator. She passed the reception desk. She pressed the button. She rode down 14 floors. She stepped out into the lobby with the marble floors and the unsmiling security guards, and she walked out through the glass doors into the Seoul morning, and the street noise hit her all at once. Buses, horns, the distant call of a food vendor. And she stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed. Her vision was not blurring. Her hands were not shaking. That surprised her somehow. She had always imagined grief would arrive loudly, would knock her off her feet, would announce itself. Instead, it arrived like a stone settling to the bottom of water. Quiet. Heavy. Final. She walked to the nearest corner, stood against a wall, and allowed herself exactly 1 minute. She counted that too. She pressed her palm flat against her own stomach through the fabric of the green dress. and she thought about the comma shape on the ultrasound and the heartbeat she had been allowed to listen to for almost a full minute. Then she opened her phone and started looking for hotels. She did not go back to the apartment that day. She checked into a place in Mapogu. Mid-range, clean, unremarkable. Paid cash. Used her own name because she had no reason yet not to. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time and did not cry, and eventually ordered food she didn't eat. Over the next 48 hours, she was methodical in a way that surprised even herself. She called her own financial advisor, not the one Min-jae had recommended, but a woman she'd found independently 2 years ago, because something in her had always insisted on having one thing that was entirely separate. She reviewed the accounts that were legally hers, her fellowship savings, a small investment portfolio, the funds from her mother's estate that had been kept carefully in her name only. It was not a fortune, but it was enough. It was hers. She called a lawyer, not a family lawyer, not anyone connected to Min-jae's circle. Someone she found through a legal directory, a woman with an office in Yongsan and a calm voice, and no visible reaction when Amar described her situation. She did not hire a private detective. She did not look through his phone records. She did not write a letter or send a message asking for an explanation. She already knew what had happened. She didn't need more evidence. She had 2 years of a marriage and 4 inches of door gap, and together those two things told her everything she needed to understand. She signed the divorce papers herself, had them reviewed by the lawyer, and arranged for them to be delivered to the apartment the following evening, along with her wedding ring, which she left in a small dish on the dining table beside the anniversary candles she had lit before she left that morning. She had cooked the dinner the night before, left it covered in the refrigerator with a heating note. At the time, she thought she was being considerate. Now she left it where it was because she didn't have the energy to be petty, and she had never been petty anyway, even when she had good reason. She took nothing that wasn't legally and clearly hers. She left the apartment the way she'd found it, furnished, orderly, full of things she had lived inside without quite making her own. The only thing she packed that she hadn't bought herself was a cardigan Min-jae had left in her side of the closet once, dark gray, never reclaimed. She packed it and then took it back out and then put it in again. She kept it. She would figure out why later. Han Dae-sik found the footage on the 3rd day. He was not looking for trouble. He was reviewing standard security logs from that floor, routine, something he did every week. And there she was, Amara, stepping off the elevator at 9:47 in the morning, gift bag in hand, walking down the hall with an energy in her posture that he recognized as something close to excitement. He had not seen her look like that in a while. Then she slowed, stopped, stood outside the boss's door for almost 90 seconds. Then she did something with the bag, and she turned around. And whatever she had looked like walking in, she looked nothing like that walking out. Han watched the clip 3 times. Then he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling and thought about a lot of things he wasn't supposed to think about if he wanted to keep his job. He did not tell Min-jae immediately. He spent 24 hours deciding whether to. Min-jae had, in the meantime, returned home to a cold dinner and a wedding ring and signed papers. According to the 2 men stationed outside the building, he had gone very still when he entered the apartment, stood in the dining room for a long time, and then sat down in a chair and did not move for almost an hour. When Han finally showed him the footage, Min-jae watched it once. His expression did not change in any way that Han could read. He set the tablet down. "Where is she?" he said. Not a question, exactly. "We're looking," Han said. "How long?" "She checked out of a hotel in Mapo 2 days ago. Cash. She's been deliberate." Min-jae looked at the tablet again, at the frozen frame of Amara's back as she walked toward the elevator, the gift bag visible for a single frame before it disappeared into her purse. "What was in the bag?" he said. Han didn't answer because he didn't know. Min-jae stood up and walked to the window. Outside, Seoul moved the way it always did. Dense, loud, indifferent. "Find her," he said. "Don't approach. Don't contact. Just find her." What Han did not tell him yet, could not tell him, because the information had not yet arrived on his desk, was what a clinic's records would reveal 9 days later, quietly surfaced through channels that walked the edge of legal. He would tell him then. And everything Min-jae thought he understood about what he had lost would have to be rebuilt from the beginning. Han Dae-sik delivered the clinic report on a Tuesday morning 9 days after Amara disappeared. He didn't email it. He didn't send it through any of the usual channels. He printed it on plain paper, folded it once, and carried it in his jacket pocket through 3 security checkpoints before setting it on Min Jae's desk without a word. Min Jae was on the phone. He held up one finger. Wait. Finished the call in under 40 seconds, which was fast even for him, and picked up the paper. Han watched him read it. He had known Kang Min-jae for 11 years. He had watched him receive news of rival attacks, of police investigations, of men he trusted turning on him in ways that cost blood and money both. In 11 years, he had seen Min-jae's face do exactly 3 things when he received bad news: go still, go flat, or go cold. Each one meant something different to the people who knew how to read him. Still meant he was calculating. Flat meant the matter was already decided. Cold meant someone was going to regret what they'd done. Reading the clinic report, Min Jae's face did none of those 3 things. It did something Han had never seen before. It cracked, just for a second, just around the eyes and the line of his jaw the way a wall cracks before it understands it's going to fall. Then it closed back up, but slower than usual, like the mechanism was stiff. He set the paper down. He said, "How certain is this?" "The registration is confirmed," Han said. "Her name, her ID number. 8 weeks at time of registration. That was 12 days ago." Min Jae didn't move. "She came to the office," he said. "Yes." "That morning, with a bag." "Yes." Min Jae pushed back from the desk. He stood up and walked to the window the way he always did when he needed to think, except this time he didn't look at the city. He looked at the glass itself, at his own reflection, which Han thought might have been the first time he'd ever seen the man do that. "She was going to tell me," Min Jae said. It wasn't a question. Han said nothing. She stood outside the door. Min Jae's voice was level and precise in the way that meant he was using all his energy to keep it that way. She heard. She saw. And she left without... He stopped, started again. She never said a word. "No." The silence lasted almost a full minute. Then Min Jae said, "Get me Seo-ah." Han's expression didn't change. "Now?" "Right now, Shasakim." Yoon Seo-ah arrived in 4 minutes. She was composed in the way she was always composed. Tailored jacket, hair controlled, face arranged in the particular neutral expression that said she was prepared for any version of this conversation. She had been prepared, Han suspected, for some version of this conversation for a while. She sat down across from Min Jae's desk. He didn't sit. He stood at the window with his back to her for long enough that any other person would have spoken to fill the silence. Seo-ah didn't. She waited. When he turned, his face was flat, the calculated kind. "Tell me what she heard," he said. Seo-ah's composure did not break, but something beneath it shifted. "I don't know what..." "Don't." His voice didn't rise. It never rose. It went the other direction. Quieter, which was worse. "I've seen the footage. I know exactly where she was standing and exactly how long she stood there. Tell me what she heard." A pause. Seo-ah looked at her hands once, briefly, which was the closest Han had ever seen her come to showing anything real. "We were talking," she said. "About her." Yes." "What did you say?" Another pause. Longer. "Seo-ah." His voice was a door closing. "I said she was..." Seo-ah stopped, recalibrated. "I said she didn't know what she'd married into, that she was..." A breath. "I said she was good at waiting at home." The room was very quiet. "And I laughed," Min Jae said. She didn't answer. "I didn't correct you. I didn't walk out. I stood there and I let you describe my wife like she was something harmless and amusing, and I laughed." He wasn't accusing her. He was recounting. The distinction was somehow worse. "And she was standing 4 feet away carrying..." He stopped. He turned back to the window. "You're reassigned to the Busan office," he said. "Effective today. Han will arrange the transfer." Seo-ah stood. Her chin came up by about 2 degrees. "Min Jae..." "That's Director Kang," Han said from the corner, quiet and final. She left. Min Jae stayed at the window for a while after the door closed. Han could hear his breathing, slower than normal, deliberate, like a man counting something. I need her found, Min-jae said. Not watched. Found. Location, condition, everything. I'm working on it. Work faster. Amara had chosen the town of Gosapo almost accidentally. She had been on a bus heading south with no specific destination, which was not something she had ever done before. She was a planner, had always been a planner, the kind of person who made lists and then made lists about her lists. But planning required knowing what you were planning toward, and she had no idea what she was planning toward anymore. So she sat on the bus and watched the landscape change from city to suburb to coast. And when the bus stopped in Gosapo and she looked out the window at the gray water and the low wooden buildings and the complete absence of anyone who might recognize her, she got off. She found a room above a fish market through a handwritten notice in the window of a convenience store. The landlady was a woman in her late 60s named Madame Cho, who asked no questions and accepted 2 months' cash up front and seemed to regard Amara's presence in her building as neither remarkable nor inconvenient, which was exactly what Amara needed. The room smelled like salt and old wood. The window looked out over the harbor. In the mornings, she could hear the market below starting before dawn. The thump of crates, the calls of the vendors, the occasional argument that resolved itself without escalating. She lay in the narrow bed and listened to all of it and pressed her hand against her stomach and tried to figure out what she was going to do. The nausea was worse by then. Real morning sickness, the grinding relentless kind. Not the occasional rolling tide she'd had at first. She kept crackers beside the bed. She drank ginger tea that Madame Cho left outside her door without being asked, which was either perceptive or just the habit of a woman who had housed enough people to recognize the signs. She called her sister Maya on a Thursday afternoon, standing at the harbor railing with the wind off the water pulling at her hair. "You're somewhere windy," Maya said immediately. "Coast?" "Which coast?" "South Korea coast." A pause. "Amara, what happened?" She had planned to ease into it. She had planned to say something measured and calm about a decision she'd made thoughtfully. Instead, she opened her mouth and said, "I left Min-jae," and her voice fractured on the last syllable in a way she hadn't expected and hadn't given herself permission to do. Maya didn't gasp, didn't say, "Oh no," or "I knew it," or any of the things people said when they were performing concern rather than feeling it. She just said, "Okay. Are you safe?" "Yes." "Are you somewhere safe?" "Yes." "Do you need me to come?" Amara closed her eyes. The water was very loud and very cold sounding, and somewhere down the harbor a boat horn went off long and low. "Not yet," she said. "I need to think first." "Okay." Maya's voice was steady. "I'm here. Call me whenever. I won't tell anybody anything." "I know." "Amara." "Yeah." "Whatever happened, you're going to be okay. You've always been okay even when things weren't." Amara pressed her free hand harder against her stomach, the shape inside her that was the size of a comma, the heartbeat she'd listened to for a full minute. "There's something else," she said. "Something I need to tell you." She told her. Maya was quiet for a long time after. Then she said, "Does he know?" "No." "Are you going to tell him?" Amara looked out at the gray water, at the boats rocking in the harbor, at the horizon where the sky and the sea met in a line so flat and indifferent it looked like something you could walk to if you were determined enough. "I don't know," she said, and that was the most honest thing she had said to anyone in weeks. Min-jae's organization found her in 17 days. Han delivered the location with a single address on a single card, the way he delivered everything. Min-jae read it and set it down and then picked it up again and read it twice more. "She's stable," Han said. "Prenatal appointment last week, clinic 20 minutes from the address." Min-jae nodded. He was already reaching for his jacket. "There's something else." Something in Han's voice made Min-jae stop. "We've been running standard counter surveillance since she left, watching for anyone tracking her through our channels." Han paused. "Someone found her." The jacket stopped moving. "Before us?" Min-jae said. "At the same time. Maybe slightly before. There's a vehicle that's been in Gosapo for 6 days, registered to a shell company with no real address. We ran it 4 times. Han set a photograph on the desk, a nondescript gray sedan parked on a street near the harbor. It's Choi Seung-ho's people. The name landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Choi Seung-ho ran the second-largest criminal organization in Korea and had been trying to find a wedge into Min Jae's territory for 3 years. He was methodical, patient, and entirely without sentimentality, which made him more dangerous than men who acted on feeling. Min Jae picked up the photograph. "How did they find her?" he said. Very quiet. The cold kind of quiet. "We don't know yet. The leak is internal. Has to be. She's been careful enough that a random trace wouldn't have gotten there this fast." Min Jae set the photograph down. His thumb pressed into the corner of it for a moment. "Who knew we were looking for her?" "The core team, 6 people including me. Pull their records, all of them, yesterday." Han nodded. "Already started. And get 2 cars to Gosapo tonight, positioned, not visible. If anyone moves toward her building, I want to know about it before they reach the door." "Done. I'm going down there myself." Han didn't argue, which meant he had already anticipated this and decided it was the right call. "I'll drive." "No." Min Jae put on his jacket. "You stay here and find out who talked. I need you here more than I need you in the car." He drove south alone, which was something he hadn't done in years. No security detail, no second vehicle, no protocol. Just the highway unrolling in front of him in the dark, and the city getting smaller in the rear-view mirror, and the radio off because he couldn't tolerate sound right now. He drove for 2 hours and thought about 11 days. He thought about the anniversary dinner left on the table, covered carefully with a handwritten heating note, because even walking out of a marriage she had thought about whether he'd eat properly. He thought about the wedding ring in the small dish, no note attached, no dramatic gesture, just the ring, and the papers, and the candles burned halfway down. He thought about the footage. Amara walking toward his office with that energy in her shoulders, that forward momentum, the gift bag swinging lightly in her hand. He thought about what she must have sounded like, standing in that hallway. Not a sound. Not one sound. 2 years. He had spent 2 years sleeping beside a woman who, as it turned out, had the kind of strength that didn't announce itself. Didn't need to be witnessed or applauded, just existed quietly like infrastructure, like something you don't appreciate until you discover what happens when it's gone. He had not appreciated it. He had done something much worse than not appreciate it. He had actively participated in its dismissal. He had stood at a window with another woman and let his wife be reduced to a punchline, sweet, oblivious, waiting at home. And he had made a sound that was close enough to laughter to not be anything else. He gripped the steering wheel harder. He was not a man who apologized. He had not built what he'd built by bending toward his own mistakes and naming them out loud. He had built it by being right more often than anyone around him, and by not permitting himself the luxury of being wrong in ways that cost him power. What he understood now, driving alone through the dark at 2 a.m, was that he had been making a different kind of calculation for 2 years and hadn't known it. He had been measuring everything. Deals, territories, alliances, leverage, and not measuring the one thing that turned out to matter most. He had been an idiot in the particular way that very smart men are sometimes idiots, completely, and without any awareness of it. The town of Gosapo appeared ahead as a scatter of lights against the black coastline. He pulled off the highway and drove the slower road into the center of town, past the closed market stalls and the empty harbor road. He had the address. He did not intend to go there tonight. He only needed to see the car Han had flagged. The gray sedan, Choi's people, parked on the harbor road 6 days now. He found it in 4 minutes. Parked in the shadow of a storage building, good angle on the main street. Occupied, so he could see the faint glow of a phone screen through the side window. So, they were watching her around the clock. Min Jae sat in his car 50 meters back and looked at the sedan and felt something that was not quite anger and not quite fear, and was specifically the emotion that arrived when he understood that something he had caused was now threatening something that could not defend itself. His phone buzzed. Han. He answered. "I found the leak," Han said. No preamble, no softening. "Who?" A pause that lasted exactly long enough to tell Min Jae this was going to be a name he knew. Park Do-hyun. Min-jae said nothing. It's clean, Han said. Financial transfers, encrypted messages, the timeline matches. He's been talking to Choi Seung-ho's people for at least 4 months. He flagged Amara's disappearance to them the same day you sent us looking for her. Do-hyun, 26 years old. Min-jae had pulled him personally from a street crew in Incheon 6 years ago, recognized something useful in the way the kid thought, and brought him up through the organization step by step, had trusted him with things he didn't trust to men twice his age. Does he know you found it? Min-jae said. Not yet. Keep it that way. He ended the call. He sat in the dark and looked at the sedan and breathed slowly through his nose. The situation had just changed entirely. This was no longer about a marriage destroyed and a wife who had every reason to never speak to him again. This was about a pregnant woman in a room above a fish market who had no security detail and no reason to believe she was being watched, who had fled to this town specifically to be alone and safe, and who was neither of those things. Amara was not just his wife. She was not just the mother of his unborn child. She was right now in the middle of a game she didn't know she was being used in, and the people who had placed her there were sitting 50 meters ahead of him in a gray sedan watching her building with a phone lit up in the dark. He could not come to her as a husband. He had forfeited that. But she was in danger that he had created, and that meant the shape of his obligation was different from what he wanted it to be, and what he wanted was irrelevant anyway. He started the car. He drove toward her building, not the sedan. He parked on the street opposite and looked up at the window on the second floor where a light was still on at 2:30 in the morning. Because of course she was awake, she had always been a light sleeper. She would lie awake and press her hand against her stomach and think about what came next the way she thought about everything, carefully and alone. He could not walk up there tonight, not because he was afraid of what she'd say, though he was, in a way, he didn't have adequate vocabulary for, but because walking up there tonight without preparation, without a plan, without being able to offer her something concrete besides his regret, would be wrong. And he had already been wrong enough. He sat outside her building for 31 minutes. He counted. Then he drove back to the highway and pointed the car towards Seoul, because he had a traitor inside his own organization and 6 years of trust to reckon with, and a woman who had every right to want nothing from him. He had a lot of work to do before he could ask her for anything. The light in her window stayed on until he couldn't see it anymore. He was back in Seoul before dawn. The highway had been empty the way highways only are between 3 and 5 in the morning. That specific loneliness of a road designed for volume running at nothing. Min-jae drove it at 140 kilometers per hour with both hands on the wheel and his jaw set and his mind working through what he knew, the way he always worked through problems, systematically, without sentiment, building the structure before deciding what to do inside it. What he knew, Do-hyun had been talking to Choi Seung-ho for 4 months. The information he'd passed included, at minimum, the fact of Amara's disappearance and the organization's search for her. Choi's people had been in Gosapo for 6 days, which meant they had found her before Min-jae did, or at the same moment, which meant Do-hyun had either given them her location directly or given them enough thread to pull. What he didn't know yet, what Choi intended to do with that location, watch and wait. Use her as leverage in a negotiation. Something worse. He parked in the underground structure beneath the headquarters building at 4:47 in the morning and sat in the car for 3 minutes before going inside. The building at 5 in the morning was not empty. His organization did not have hours. It had shifts, rotations, a permanent low hum of activity that never fully stopped. The night crew looked up when he came through and then looked back at their screens, which was correct behavior. Han was already at his desk. This did not surprise Min-jae. Han Dae-sik had not, in 11 years of working together, ever needed to be summoned twice or found anywhere except exactly where he was needed. "Tell me everything," Min-jae said, dropping into the chair across from Han's desk. Han turned his monitor. A file was already open. Do-hyun's financial records, the encrypted communications, a timeline that Han had built out over what must have been the entire night. "It started 8 months ago," Han said. "Not 4. I was conservative before because I wanted to be certain. 8 months. Small things at first, schedules, route patterns, nothing operational. Testing the connection, testing what Choi would pay for. Min Jae looked at the timeline. 8 months ago, he had been sitting across a dinner table from Do Hyun, talking about expanding the Incheon operation because he had trusted the kid's read on the local dynamics. He had listened to his analysis and implemented 2 of his suggestions. What escalated it? Min Jae said. You did, Han said. Flat. Not cruel, just accurate. When you started pulling back from meetings, after Amara left. 3 weeks ago, you canceled 4 scheduled sit-downs with crime family representatives, missed a territory negotiation in Busan. Do Hyun told Choi you were compromised, emotionally compromised. His word, from the messages, he used the word distracted. Min Jae was quiet. Choi agreed, Han continued. They decided to move. The plan is best I can reconstruct it. Use Amara as pressure, not harm, at least not initially. Approach her, make it clear she's visible, make it clear her safety has a price. Force you to the table from a position of personal fear rather than strategic strength. And if I don't come to the table? Han's expression did not change. The messages get less specific after that point, deliberately vague. Min Jae understood what deliberate vagueness meant in this context. It meant the option existed, was understood by both parties, and was being preserved as a threat rather than a plan, which was, in its own way, worse than a plan. Where is Do Hyun right now? He said. Apartment in Mapo. He came in yesterday, worked a normal day, left at 7. He doesn't know we found it. Good, Min Jae stood. I want him brought in at 6, before the day shift arrives. Quietly. Han nodded. And the Gosapo situation? 2 more cars down there by morning. I want eyes on that sedan around the clock. If they move toward her building, they get stopped. I don't care how. Understood. Min Jae started toward his office, then stopped. Han. Yes. 8 months. He didn't turn around. I missed 8 months. Han said nothing, which was the right response. Min Jae went to his office and did not sleep. Park Do Hyun arrived at headquarters at 6:03 in the morning inside a car he thought was his regular morning pickup. He was 26, compact, with a face that still looked younger than his age and a habit of carrying himself with slightly more confidence than the situation warranted, which Min Jae had always read as ambition. He had cultivated that ambition deliberately, pointed it toward useful things. He walked into the building and was guided to the lower conference room by 2 men he knew well, and nothing about that felt wrong until the door closed and Min Jae was sitting at the table. Do Hyun stopped. He had good instincts. Min Jae had always known that. He could see the calculation happening in real time behind the younger man's eyes, how much was known, which direction to run the play, whether there was a version of this he could talk his way through. He sat down without being asked, which told Min Jae he had decided on a posture. Director, Do Hyun said. Calm. Even. Min Jae had a single folder on the table in front of him. He didn't open it. He looked at Do Hyun for a long moment with no expression on his face. How much did he pay you? He said. The calm lasted about 2 more seconds. I don't know what... Do Hyun. Min Jae's voice was very quiet. I have 8 months of financial records, 46 encrypted messages, and a gray sedan in Gosapo with your fingerprints on the introduction. I am not asking you what happened. I'm asking you how much he paid you, because that is the only variable I don't have yet. Do Hyun's jaw tightened. The performance of calm dissolved and something rawer came through. Not quite fear, something more complicated. Enough, he said. For what? To matter. Do Hyun's chin came up by a degree. I've been running Incheon for 2 years. You know what Incheon generates? You know what percentage of that I see? I built that operation from... I know what you built. Min Jae's voice stayed level. I was there. I built you before you built anything, and kept me exactly where you needed me. Something cracked open in Do Hyun's voice. Not grief, more like pressure that had been looking for a seam. I'm not angry about the money. I'm angry that I spent 6 years being useful and you never once... He stopped. regrouped. You looked at me and saw a tool. You looked at my wife, Min-jae said, and saw a different tool. Silence. Do-hyun's eyes dropped for the first time. She was never supposed to be touched, he said. That was explicit with Choi. She's just leverage, pressure. Nobody touches her. You told a man who has spent 3 years trying to dismantle everything I've built exactly where my pregnant wife is living alone with no security. Min-jae's voice had not risen once. It had done the other thing, gotten quieter and quieter until it was almost nothing, which in this room, with this man, carried a weight that volume never could. And you told me you negotiated the terms of her safety. Do-hyun said nothing. You were 20 years old when I found you, Min-jae said. You were running cigarettes for a crew that didn't know what to do with how fast you thought. I pulled you out of that, and I put you somewhere your mind could be used for something. I made you. He paused. I should have paid more attention to what I was making. The room was quiet for a long time. What happens now? Do-hyun said. His voice had lost the edge. He sounded for the first time his actual age. Now, Min-jae said, you're going to tell me everything. Every communication with Choi, every piece of information you passed, every plan you're aware of, the ones that were discussed and the ones that were implied. Everything. And you're going to do it right now while there's still time for it to be useful. Do-hyun looked at the table. And after. After depends on before. It took 2 hours. Han called at 9:14 in the morning. Min-jae was still in the conference room. Do-hyun had been taken elsewhere. Min-jae had a legal pad with 17 pages of notes and a specific, dense, low-frequency kind of anger sitting in his chest that he was managing with great precision. They moved, Han said. Min-jae was already standing. Which direction? Her building. 2 men, this morning at 8:30. They went in. The air in the room changed. Are they still inside? Min-jae said. Our guys pulled them out on the street before they reached her floor. It's handled, but Min-jae, Han paused, which Han never did. She saw it. The hallway window faces the street. She was up early. She saw 2 men get pushed against the wall outside her building by people she didn't recognize. Min-jae was already moving toward the door. She called the police, Han said. He stopped walking. Local precinct. She reported suspicious men outside her building. Officers responded, found nothing because our guys had cleared out by then, but they took her statement. Another pause. One of the officers recognized what it actually was. He made a call. The call went to someone who owes Choi Seung-ho a favor. By this afternoon, Choi is going to know we have people in Gosapo, and he's going to know she made a police report, and he'll move faster, Min-jae said. Yes. Min-jae walked out of the building and got into his car. The drive took 2 hours and 12 minutes because he didn't stop. He called Han twice on the way down. The sedan was still in position. Choi's people hadn't made another move yet, but that wouldn't last. Do-hyun's information had included a detail that changed the timeline. Choi had already made contact with 2 other crime family leaders, testing whether they'd support a formal move against Min-jae's territories if Min-jae was sufficiently distracted. One had declined. One had not declined, which was a different thing from agreeing, but not by much. The structure Min-jae had spent 20 years building was not falling, but it was being tested in multiple places at once, deliberately, by someone who understood that a structure under simultaneous stress in multiple locations will eventually find its weakest point. Min-jae knew what his weakest point was. She was on the 2nd floor of a building above a fish market, and she didn't know yet that he was coming. He parked on a street 2 blocks from her building and walked the rest of the way, because a car pulling up directly would be visible to whoever was watching from the sedan. He wore a jacket with the collar up and moved like someone with somewhere ordinary to be, which was something he was still capable of when he needed to be. Anonymity was a skill, and he had not forgotten how to use it. He found the entrance to the building on a side street, a narrow door, unlocked. Stairs that smelled like salt and wood and something frying somewhere. He went up. He knocked on the door at the end of the 2nd floor hallway. Silence. Then a voice. Careful, controlled, the voice of someone who had already been startled once today. "Who is it?" Min-jae pressed his hand flat against the doorframe. "It's me," he said. The silence on the other side of that door lasted a long time. He heard her move, heard her stop, heard what he thought might be her hand on the doorknob and then not on the doorknob. "Amara," he kept his voice low. "I know you don't want to open the door. I know you have every reason not to, but I need you to listen to me for 3 minutes and then you can tell me to go, and I will go. I need 3 minutes." Another silence. The door opened. She looked like herself, and also not. She was in a gray sweater and loose pants, hair pulled back with a clip that wasn't quite doing its job. Several strands had escaped around her face. She had lost some weight, which made the roundness below her sweater more visible than she might have intended, and she was looking at him with an expression that he could not fully decode and did not deserve to. She was not crying, she was not yelling, her face was a closed door, which was new. When he'd known her, she'd been transparent in the particular way of people who have never had reason to hide things. Now she was looking at him with something careful and flat behind her eyes. She stepped back from the door. Not an invitation, just not a refusal either. He walked in. The room was small and very clean, in the way that someone kept a space when keeping it tidy was the only thing they could control. A table with her laptop and a half-empty tea mug, a window with the harbor visible beyond it. The bed was made with military precision. On the nightstand, a clear sleeve with a photograph inside. He didn't look directly at it, but he registered what it was. She stood on the other side of the table, arms not crossed, hands at her sides, which somehow seemed more guarded. 3 minutes, she said. "You're being watched." He kept it direct. This was not the time for preamble or apology. "The men you saw outside your building this morning, that was Choi Seung-ho. He's the second most powerful crime leader in Korea, and he has been using someone inside my organization to track you since you disappeared." Something moved behind her eyes. "Track me." "You were never randomly found. Someone who knew we were looking for you gave your location to Choi because—" He stopped. This part was harder to say in this room. "Because they believed that finding you, threatening you, was the best way to get to me." She stared at him. "They're using you as leverage," he said. "They think if they make you afraid enough or take you somewhere, I'll negotiate from a position of panic instead of strength. Which," he exhaled, "which is not a wrong assessment of how I would react." The word leverage sat in the air between them. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," he said. "I'm not asking you to come back or give me anything. What I'm telling you is that this room is no longer safe, and I have cars outside and I can get you somewhere that is safe, tonight, right now, and then I will leave you alone if that's what you want." Amara looked at him for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "How did they find me?" "Someone I trusted. A man I trained." "Someone you trusted?" Her voice was very even. "You know what I find interesting about that? The irony of that." He didn't look away. "Yes. You want to move me somewhere safe." She looked around the room, the clean table, the made bed, the harbor in the window, the life she had built in 26 days. Safe meaning surrounded by your people. Safe meaning not visible to Choi's organization. And the difference between being a target for your enemy and being a... She stopped, looked for the word. "What would I be exactly in your safe place?" "Protected. By the people who work for the man who..." She stopped again. Her jaw tightened. This was the cost of the closed door. Things she didn't let out came back up sideways. "Who laughed?" she said. "When your secretary described me. You laughed." The word landed the way it was meant to. "Yes," he said. "And you think you can protect me." "I know I can." He kept his voice level. "Whatever I've failed at, and I know what I've failed at, this is something I can do. And your daughter needs me to do it." Amara went very still. "Han found the clinic record," he said quietly. "I know." She pressed her hand flat against her stomach in the gesture he had seen her make without realizing. The one she probably didn't know she was making, Her eyes were bright and not blinking, and she was working very hard to keep her face where she had put it. She, Amara said. The word came out different from the others. Smaller. Han's report said the technician made a note. Probable female, 22 weeks. He paused. I don't know if you found that out yet, or if... I found out last week, she said. Her voice was not quite steady on that sentence. They stood on opposite sides of the table in a room that smelled like salt and wood, and Min-jae felt the full weight of every decision he had made in the past 2 years settle onto the moment, in a way that was precise and physical, and without any possibility of adjustment. He had done this. The woman across from him, the daughter neither of them had held yet, the gray sedan on the harbor road, he had built the conditions for all of it with his own choices, and the only remaining question was what he was going to do inside those conditions. I'll take you somewhere he can't find you, Min-jae said. And then I'm going to deal with Choi and with Do-hyun and with whoever else needs dealing with. And when that's done, I will bring you the documented proof that you're no longer a target, and what you do after that is entirely your decision. Amara looked at him across the table. If I go with you, she said slowly, I need you to understand something. Tell me. I'm not going back to you. I'm not... She pressed her lips together. I'm going with you because she comes first. Not because I trust you, not because I forgive you. She comes first, and you happen to be the person who can make her safe right now. The moment that changes, the moment someone else can do that better, I will make that choice without asking your permission. Min-jae nodded. One more thing, Amara said. Yes. Don't ever laugh at me again. It was not a threat. It was quieter than a threat and more permanent than one. It was the sentence of a woman who had stood in a hallway and held herself completely still while her marriage ended through a 4-inch gap in a door, and who was now telling him exactly one thing she needed him to understand before she trusted him with anything at all. No, he said, I won't. She picked up the clear sleeve from the nightstand, the ultrasound, the comma shape, their daughter, and tucked it into the front pocket of her bag with the focused care of someone packing what actually mattered. Then she said, Give me 10 minutes. He waited in the hallway. Through the closed door, he could hear her moving, Chad. Quiet, efficient, the sounds of someone who had already learned how to leave in a hurry. His phone buzzed. Han. He answered. Choi just pulled the sedan, Han said. All 4 of his people in Gosapo are moving. The sedan and a second vehicle we hadn't flagged. Min-jae looked at the closed door. Direction, he said. Her street, Han said. Min-jae knocked twice, hard. Amara, we need to go now. A pause. 2 seconds. I'm ready, she said through the door. And when it opened and she stepped out with her bag over her shoulder and her hand pressed flat against her stomach and that closed-door expression still on her face, he understood with complete clarity that this woman had been ready for a long time. Ready to fight, ready to run, ready to protect what she had decided mattered. And that the only thing that had ever been unprepared in this marriage was him. He moved in front of her down the stairs. Behind them, through the building's thin walls, he could hear a car pulling onto the street outside. They were out of time. They came out of the building into cold morning air, and Min-jae already had his hand on her arm, not gripping, just directional, steering her left instead of right, away from the harbor road where the car had pulled onto the street with its headlights still on in the gray morning. Amara moved without arguing. She matched his pace immediately, bag pulled tight across her body, one hand pressed flat against her stomach. Not panic, just the reflex of a woman who had spent weeks making certain that nothing hit too hard, nothing jostled wrong. She didn't ask where they were going. She read the direction of his body and moved with it, which told him something about what the past weeks alone in that room had built in her. She was not the same woman who had stood frozen outside his office door. Something had sharpened since then. Something had learned to move fast without losing its footing. He pulled her into the alley running parallel to the main street, narrower, the walls closed on both sides, fish smell and old wood, and the cold concentrated between the buildings. Behind them he heard a car door, then another, then a third. Multiple points of entry. Choi's people had staged this properly, covered the main approaches, anticipated the obvious exits. Min-jae had been in worse positions. He tried to remember when. His phone was already in his hand, Han's number already ringing. We're moving, Min-jae said the instant Han picked up. East Alley behind the market building. 3 of Choi's people minimum, possibly 4. I need extraction in under 2 minutes. Ryu is 90 seconds out. East end of the alley, not the west. Copy. He ended the call and pushed the phone back into his jacket without slowing. The alley was 30 meters long, and he could see the east opening ahead, gray morning light cutting through, the sound of the market beginning on the road beyond. Footsteps behind them, faster now. Not running, controlled jogging, the pace of men who needed to close distance without drawing the attention of the vendors setting up 30 meters to the left. Amara said nothing. Her breathing was elevated but controlled, the focused rhythm of someone who had made a decision about what their body was going to do and was holding it to that decision by will alone. Don't stop at the end, Min-jae said. Turn right. Keep moving until I tell you to stop. Okay. 20 meters, 15. A figure appeared at the east opening of the alley. One of Choi's men, cutting off the exit. He must have run the outer street to get ahead of them. Young, broad, hands already out of his pockets, and his weight forward on the balls of his feet, 10 meters between them. Min-jae didn't slow. He covered the distance in 4 steps and drove his right shoulder hard into the man's chest before he could set his stance, the impact jarring up through Min-jae's collarbone and neck, the man's back hitting the alley wall with a sound that echoed off both sides. The man grabbed at Min-jae's jacket, and Min-jae got his left forearm under the man's chin and pushed. Not a trained technique, just leverage and intent, pinning him against the brick long enough. Go, he said to Amara without looking. She went past him at the edge of a run. He held the man against the wall for another 3 seconds, felt the resistance in the man's body telegraphing that he was about to push back hard, and stepped away instead of fighting it, let the man's own counter-pressure pitch him forward off the wall, bought 2 more seconds of reorganization, and went after Amara. He came out of the alley onto the market road. Amara was 20 feet ahead of him, moving right the way he'd told her, navigating around a crate of fish being unloaded from a truck, while the vendor stared at her with the bewildered expression of a man whose morning had become more interesting than intended. Ryu's car appeared from the north end of the road. Black, moving fast, already slowing as it reached them. The back door swung open while it was still rolling, and Amara got in with the practiced momentum of someone who had decided not to hesitate about anything today. Min-jae got in behind her. The door closed. The car was moving again before the latch caught. In the side mirror, he could see 2 of Choi's men emerging from the alley entrance. The third was still somewhere behind the market building. One of them was on a phone. They were already reporting position, direction, vehicle description. They have the plate, Min-jae said. Switched it 20 minutes ago, Ryu said, already turning north onto the wider coastal road. They have a wrong plate. Min-jae sat back. Amara's breathing was the loudest sound in the car. She had both hands pressed flat on her thighs, and her eyes were closed, and she was doing something very deliberate and controlled with her exhales, counting them out, longer than the inhales. He watched her do it and said nothing because interrupting it would be wrong, and also because it was working. By the 3rd cycle, her shoulders had dropped a centimeter from where they'd been locked. Are you? Give me a second, she said, eyes still closed. He gave her a second, several of them. When she opened her eyes, they were clear and direct, and she looked at him with the flat attention that had replaced the openness he remembered. Where are we going? She said. Mountain estate north of Jecheon. Han has people there already. It's clean. It's off any record Choi would have. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked out the front windshield at the coastal road opening ahead of them, the gray water on the left, the hills on the right starting to rise. Okay, she said. His phone buzzed. Han. He answered. You're out. Han said it as a statement already confirmed. Moving north. You have a problem. The word settled in the car like something dropped from height. Ryu's eyes moved fractionally to the rearview mirror. Amara didn't move, but something in her posture registered the shift in Min-jae's body. Talk, Min-jae said. The estate. Do-hyun's communication logs. I found another layer an hour ago buried deeper than the operational stuff. 8 weeks ago, he gave Choi a full property inventory. Every holding associated with your name or any shell we've used in the past 5 years. The estate is on the list, Min-jae. It has been for 2 months. The road kept moving under the car. The water kept moving on the left. How many? Min-jae said. Our surveillance shows 4 men at the upper access road as of an hour ago. Possibly more inside the perimeter. They've had 2 months to learn the layout. The estate that Min-jae had chosen specifically because it was remote and difficult and unlisted, Choi's people had been in it long enough to know every room. He looked at the road ahead. Give me options. One good one, Han said. Park Jung-hye, Amara's friend. Her property outside Wonju. It's registered in her name only. No connection to you. Nothing Do-hyun would have flagged because he didn't know about it. I checked our records going back 3 years. It never came up. Min-jae turned and looked at Amara. She had been listening. He could tell from the particular stillness she'd taken on, the kind that meant she was processing rather than absent. Jung-hye, he said. Amara exhaled once, slowly. She's going to have opinions about this. Yes, I know. She looked at the water. She did tell me so about pretty much everything. A pause. She'll still say yes. She won't like it, but she'll say yes. She turned back. Call her before we just show up. She deserves that. Han, Min-jae said into the phone. Jung-hye's property outside Wonju. Get her a call, explain the situation, tell her we're coming and what it means. Already pulled her number, Han said. One more thing. What? Do-hyun is in holding. He's been cooperative. But in the last 2 hours since I found the deeper communication layer, I've been going through everything again. Han's voice had the quality it got when he was delivering something he wished he didn't have. Choi's move this morning wasn't improvised. The deployment, multiple vehicles, staged positions, the timing, it was planned for today specifically. Do-hyun gave him something that set a deadline. What deadline? The family council meeting 7 days from now. Choi has been building toward a formal challenge of your organization's standing in front of the network. To do that successfully, he needs to demonstrate that you're unable to maintain internal security and unable to protect what matters to you. A beat. The challenge is already in motion. Other family heads have been approached. 2 have given soft agreements to hear it. If Choi stands in front of the council in 7 days with the story of how his people took your wife from under your nose while you searched for her, that's the end of your position in the network. Not just weakened, finished. Min-jae closed his eyes for 1 second. 1 complete second in which he understood the full architecture of what had been built against him while he'd been driving south to stand outside a window for 31 minutes, counting his own inability to knock on a door. He opened his eyes. Change of route, he said to Ryu. Wonju, not Jecheon. Ryu nodded once and began moving toward the inland road. Min-jae sat back and looked at the roof of the car and thought about 7 days and a council meeting and the specific way that very careful men built traps. Not quickly, not obviously, but over months, using your own architecture against you, filling in the gaps with patience and money until the day they pulled the single piece that made everything else fall. Do-hyun had been that piece. Placed 6 years ago by Min-jae's own hands. He thought about what it took to build something over 20 years and how many ways there were to lose it that had nothing to do with being outfought. Then he stopped thinking about it, because thinking about it in the car was not useful. Ryu was driving and Amara was beside him with her hand on her stomach, and they had 3 hours to Wonju, and he had 7 days to do something that he was not yet certain was possible. He started making calls. Tits. The regional road climbed away from the coast into hill country, the landscape changing from salt and gray water to bare-limbed trees and frozen field margins. Amara dozed for 40 minutes somewhere in the middle stretch. Not deeply, her head resting against the window, her hand never fully leaving her stomach even in sleep. Min-jae did not sleep. He made 8 calls in those 3 hours, each one short and specific, each one another piece of a structure he was building while the car moved. By the time Wonju appeared on the horizon, he had a framework. It was not a good framework. It was the framework available to a man who had 7 days and fewer allies than he'd had a month ago and a trader's cooperation as his primary asset. It was built on the principle that the only move Choi would not have planned for was the one Min-jae made first, publicly, before Choi could control the narrative. He laid it out for Han on the last call, 10 minutes from Jung Hye's property. You want to call the council yourself, Han said, before Choi does. If I call it, I set the terms, the agenda, the room. And in that room, I expose Do Hyun, myself. Everything, every piece of the internal breach, laid out in front of every family head in the network, from my mouth before Choi's version reaches them. Silence on Han's end. That includes admitting the breach ran 8 months before you found it, Han said. Yes. That is not a position of strength, Min-jae. It's a position of honesty, which in a room full of men who measure everything by whether they can predict you is worth more than a position of strength in this specific situation. He watched the turnoff for Jung Hye's road appear on the right. Choi's version of this makes me look compromised and reactive. My version makes me look like the man who found his own rot and cut it out before it spread to anyone else's house. Those are different stories, and I get to choose which one the room hears first. Another silence, longer. And the territories, Han said. The Incheon zones Choi actually wants. I'm going to give them to him. The silence this time was the kind that had weight. Voluntarily, Han said. In the room, in front of everyone, before he can demand them. I come to the table with a proposal. He gets what he's actually been after for 3 years. In exchange, formal end to the dispute, non-aggression understanding, and most importantly, the council sees me negotiate from choice rather than from loss. There's a difference. Everyone in that room will understand the difference. Ryu turned onto the road toward Jung Hye's property. Gravel, tree-lined, a house visible at the end with lights on in the front windows. The Incheon territories are significant, Han said. I know what they are. 20 years of... I know what they are, Han. Not hard, just final. I've known what they are for 20 years. I know what I'm giving up. Make the calls. A long pause. When do you want the council? Min-jae looked at Jung Hye's house getting closer. 5 days, not 7. I want it before Choi expects it. I'll start tonight. He ended the call as Ryu stopped the car in front of the house. Park Jung-hye was on the porch before they reached it. She was in her early 30s, carrying the sharp-edged composure of a woman who had been told something alarming an hour ago and had spent that hour deciding what to do with the alarm instead of surrendering to it. She looked at Min-jae with an expression that had several layers and was not warm on any of them. Then she looked at Amara and everything reorganized. Come inside, she said. You. To Min-jae. Porch. 1 minute. Amara went inside without looking back at him, which told him she had anticipated this and found it acceptable. Min-jae stood on the porch with Jung Hye. She folded her arms and looked at him in the specific way of a woman who knows exactly what she thinks and is deciding how much of it to deploy. She is 22 weeks pregnant, Jung Hye said. She has been alone for almost a month. She ran from people this morning. She should be eating and sleeping in a place where no one is going to drive a car at her building. Yes, Min-jae said. This is your house now? My house is your solution? Your house is the one place that isn't connected to me, which means it's the one place she's actually safe. I understand what I'm asking. Do you? Her eyes were precise and uncharitable. Because from where I'm standing, you spent 2 years being careless with her, and now you need her to be safe enough for your situation to be manageable, and you're in my house because you ran out of other options. He held her gaze. You're not wrong about most of that. She seemed to have been prepared for argument, and the absence of it recalibrated something in her expression. 24 hours, she said. After that, I'm reassessing based on what she tells me she wants, not what's convenient for your operations. Fair. You sleep in the car or the kitchen, not near her room. Understood. She held his gaze for another 3 seconds. Then she turned and went inside and left the door open, which was as close to an invitation as he was going to get, and he knew it. Okay, the next 5 days were 2 things at once. The outside of them, the operational layer, was dense and relentless. Han worked 16 hours a day pulling together the council meeting. 7 of the 9 family representatives confirmed in the first 48 hours. The 8th came in on the 3rd day after Han had a quiet conversation with a man who owed the Kong organization a favor from 2019 that had never been formally settled. The 9th was Lim Byung-tae, who confirmed on the fourth day with a message that said simply attending, which was not enthusiasm but was not refusal either. Choi Seung-ho confirmed on the afternoon of the third day. Min-jae had counted on this. Choi would come because he had been planning this council for weeks under his own timeline, and being invited to it by Min-jae instead would confuse him, and confused men came to rooms to understand what they'd missed. He would come thinking he had leverage that Min-jae didn't know about. He was wrong, but he didn't know he was wrong. And that gap was the only real advantage Min-jae had. Do-hyun's full cooperation had produced 46 pages of documentation. Financial records, message threads, dates, names, amounts. Han had organized it into a format that could be presented in a room of men who would not sit still for lengthy evidence, but would respond to clarity and specificity and the feeling that every detail had been accounted for. It was thorough. It was devastating, and it was thorough, and the person it was most devastating to was Min-jae himself, whose name was attached to every failure of oversight it represented. He read through it twice on the third night sitting at Jong-hye's kitchen table after everyone else was asleep. He read it the way you read something that is going to be used against you, looking for the worst of it, sitting inside it, not flinching. If he was going to lay it out in front of 9 family leaders and Choi Seung-ho, he needed to have already survived reading it himself. The inside of those 5 days, the other layer, was quieter and more complicated. Amara moved through Jong-hye's house with the careful deliberateness of someone rebuilding a routine in an unfamiliar space. She ate properly, which Min-jae observed without commenting on because commenting would have been wrong. She slept long, and with the particular totality of a pregnant body catching up on weeks of insufficient rest. She and Jong-hye spent hours at the kitchen table doing nothing in particular, talking sometimes, sometimes not, and the ease between them was the ease of a friendship that had been built over years and had been apparently tested thoroughly enough to know what it could hold. She did not avoid Min-jae. She also did not seek him out. They existed in the same house in parallel, occasionally intersecting, a shared meal, a brief exchange about logistics, once a longer conversation at the kitchen table when she asked him directly what the plan was and he told her all of it, without softening it, and she listened with her hands wrapped around a cup and her eyes focused and asked 2 questions that were both better than the questions he had prepared for. On the 4th evening, she came out to the porch, where he was sitting in the cold, which was where he'd been ending up every night because the cold was clarifying in a way that the warm kitchen was not. She had a blanket around her shoulders, and she sat on the step above him, and they both looked at the dark for a while without speaking. Do-hyun, she said eventually, he was someone you raised. Yes. And you're using his cooperation as the centerpiece of what you're bringing to this meeting. Yes. She held her cup with both hands. That's not easy, using what someone gave you after they tried to hurt you. It's practical. It's both, she said. Things can be both. He looked at the tree line. What you said before, she said, about building something different. Legitimate businesses. She paused. Is that real, or is it the thing you're saying because the circumstances require it? He thought about giving her the clean version. Both right now, he said. Circumstances are requiring it, and I'm finding that the thing being required happens to point somewhere I should have moved 5 years ago. Whether that makes it genuine, he stopped. I think genuine is something you demonstrate over time. I can't claim it in advance. Amara was quiet for a moment. That's a more honest answer than I expected, she said. I've been practicing. She looked at him, a brief sideways look, sharp and almost surprised. Then she looked back at the dark. He thought he saw something at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile, more like the ghost of one, there and then gone. Tomorrow, she said. Tomorrow night. Are you ready? He thought about the 46 pages. About Choi sitting at the end of a table believing he had already won. About the Incheon territories that had taken 12 years to consolidate and would be gone in an hour. I'm clear, he said, which was different from ready and more accurate. I know what I'm walking into, and I know what I'm willing to give up to walk out of it. Amara nodded slowly. Don't get yourself killed, she said. The same words she would say again later in other circumstances. But the first time she said them, they had this particular weight, Not warmth, not softness, but the weight of a woman who had not yet decided what she wanted the future to look like, but was clear that it required him to exist in it. She went inside. He sat on the porch until his hands were numb, and then went in and sat at the kitchen table with the 46 pages one last time, reading it through from the beginning, because tomorrow he was going to stand in a room and say all of it out loud, and he needed it to be the same as breathing. The warehouse in Incheon was the right choice. Equidistant, neutral, the kind of industrial space that these meetings had used for 30 years, because the acoustics were manageable and the exits were known, and no single organization could claim it as home territory. Min-jae arrived 40 minutes early. The security team Han had positioned outside nodded as he walked in. Inside, the warehouse was lit with temporary lighting that Han had arranged. Bright enough for a working meeting, not so bright it felt performative. The long table in the center was already set. Water, no alcohol. Min-jae's specification. He didn't want anyone comfortable enough to feel generous. He wanted everyone present and sharp and slightly off their normal register. He walked the space twice, checked the exits out of habit, stood at the head of the table and looked at the chairs, and thought about who would sit in each one and what they would bring with them. Han arrived at 6 with Do-hyun. Do-hyun looked like someone who had slept badly for 5 days, which was accurate. He was pale, and he held himself with a kind of careful economy of movement, like a man trying not to take up too much space in case someone decided his taking up space was intolerable. Min-jae looked at him from across the warehouse floor, and Do-hyun met his gaze and then looked at the ground and then looked back up, which was the most honest sequence of responses he had shown since the conference room. "You know what you're doing tonight," Min-jae said. "Yes." "You understand that the moment we walk out of this room, whatever arrangement we've made doesn't protect you from what other people in that room decide to think about you." Do-hyun's jaw tightened. "Yes. You're doing it anyway? You gave me the option to not be here. I'm here." He looked at the table. "I should be here. That's..." He stopped. Started again. "I made a calculation that you didn't value what you had. That's what I told myself to make it work. That you didn't value her. Didn't value..." He stopped again. Something moved across his face that was genuine and uncomfortable and did not have a clean name. "I was wrong about what I told myself. Doesn't change what I did. But I was wrong about the reason." Min-jae looked at him for a moment. "Stand where Han tells you," he said. "When I ask you to speak, speak. When I don't, don't." "Yes." The family representatives began arriving at 6:45. Min-jae greeted each one at the door, which was a deliberate choice. Host posture, territorial confidence, the body language of a man who called this meeting on his own terms. Each representative read it and registered it, and he watched them recalibrate slightly as they came in, each recalibration different, each one useful in a different way. Lim Byung-tae arrived at 6:58 and looked at Min-jae with the careful attention of a man who had been considering a hedge and was still deciding whether it was worth the cost. Min-jae said, "Byung-tae, thank you for coming." Lim said, "Of course," which told him nothing and possibly everything. Choi Sung-ho arrived at 7 on the 2nd. Not early, not late. He walked in with 2 men behind him, the permitted security, and his face wore the expression of a man who has been handed something he wanted to study before responding to it. He had expected, Min-jae knew, to arrive at a council of his own calling. The fact that he was instead arriving at Min-jae's was a variable his planning had not accommodated, and the way he carried the surprise was to wear no expression at all, which was Choi's version of discipline. He sat at the far end of the table. Min-jae sat at the head. They looked at each other across 9 other men and the full length of the table, and Min-jae felt, in his chest, the particular settling of a man who has arrived at something he cannot avoid and has decided to stop trying to. "Thank you for coming," he said to the room. "I'll be direct, because everyone here has other places to be, and I respect that more than I respect the sound of my own voice." A small movement from Lim that might have been the beginning of something. 3 weeks ago, I discovered an 8-month intelligence breach inside my organization. The source was a man I trained personally, operating under my direct authority, who had been providing operational information to an outside party in exchange for payment. That information included personnel routes, property locations, and most significantly, the location of my wife. The room was completely still. The outside party was Choi Seung-ho's organization. He said it directly, without inflection, looking at the center of the table rather than at Choi. The purpose was leverage. Force me into a territorial negotiation from a position of personal fear rather than strategic choice. He paused. The strategy was intelligent. If you're sitting here and you'd had the same intelligence picture Choi had, a man whose wife had left him, who was pulling back from meetings, who appeared emotionally compromised, the same strategy might occur to you. I want to acknowledge that before anything else, because dismissing the quality of the play would be dishonest. He saw Choi's eyes shift, just slightly, just enough. The man who ran that breach for 8 months is standing against the wall behind me, Min-jae continued. Park Do-hyun. He is here voluntarily, which required a particular kind of courage. I'm not going to pretend he didn't need to find, and I'm going to give him 60 seconds to say what he came here to say before I continue. He nodded at Do-hyun. Do-hyun walked to the center of the room. He stood there and looked at 9 men who had various reasons to think very little of him, and he said without preamble, without performance, "Everything Director Kang has said is accurate. The breach is real, the timeline is correct, and what I provided was used to endanger a civilian who had nothing to do with any of this. I cooperated fully with the internal investigation because I had no remaining justification not to." He paused. "I thought he'd gone weak. I was wrong about what weak looks like." He walked back to the wall. No one in the room spoke for 3 seconds, which was a long time in a room of men who managed everything by talking. Min-jae looked at the table. "I'm not here tonight to ask for sympathy," he said. "I missed 8 months of a breach that was running inside my own house. That is a failure of oversight, and I'm standing in front of you naming it as exactly that. What I am here to say is that the breach is closed, documented, and fully contained. Every communication has been recovered. Every asset Choi's organization positioned based on Do-hyun's information has been identified." He let that settle for a moment. "And I'm here to make a proposal." He reached inside his jacket and pulled out the folder. The 4 pages Han had prepared, clean and specific. "I'm proposing a formal end to the territorial dispute between my organization and Choi Seung-ho's. The Incheon zones, all 3, transfer to Choi's control. Clean, documented, the full legal chain available to every representative in this room." He slid copies down the table in both directions. Han moved quietly, placing 1 at each seat. "The Southern Seoul corridor remains mine. Non-aggression understanding, 7 years, witnessed by everyone in this room. The challenge Choi has been building toward the council. This meeting is the council. This is the room. Anyone who has questions or objections about the state of my organization can ask them right now." He looked directly at Lim Byung-tae. "Byung-tae," he said, "you were approached. I know you were. Ask what you want to ask." Lim looked at the folder in front of him, looked at Min-jae, looked at Choi. "The breach being closed," Lim said carefully. "You're satisfied it's complete?" "Yes." "The woman, she's secure?" "Yes." "And you're offering the Incheon zones before anyone demanded them?" "Yes." Lim was quiet for a moment. "That's not weakness," he said slowly, like a man solving an equation while saying the solution out loud. "I know what it is," Min-jae said. "I know what it looks like, and I know what it actually is. I'm relying on the people in this room to know the difference." Lim picked up the folder. The room began to move, the way rooms move when a decision has been made by the most important person in it, and others are now finding their way to the same place. Copies of the document were examined. A question from the representative on Min-jae's left about the transfer timeline. Min-jae answered it directly. 4 weeks. Full documentation. Another question about the non-aggression terms. Han fielded it from the wall. Precise. No hesitation. Choi Seung-ho had not spoken. He sat at the end of the table with his hands flat on the document in front of him and his expression unchanged. The same careful neutrality he had carried in from the door. But something underneath it had shifted, and Min-jae could see it in the set of his shoulders, the barely perceptible change in where his eyes were resting. He had walked in expecting to find a man who was trying to survive. He had found instead a man who had decided what he was willing to lose and had organized himself around that decision. Those were different opponents. Min-jae looked at him directly. "Choi Sung-ho," he said, "you've been patient, you've been methodical, and the strategy was sound. I want to say that again because it was. You found the fracture and you applied pressure in the right place at the right time." He kept his voice level and without heat. "But you built your position on the assumption that I would negotiate from the inside of my fear. I'm offering you the same outcome without the fear. The territories are the same. The agreement is the same. The only difference is this room witnesses you taking what I'm choosing to give rather than what you took by force." He paused. "I think that's worth more to you in the long run than the alternative would have been." The warehouse was very quiet. Choi looked at him for a long time, the kind of look that is doing active work, measuring, calculating, finding the edges of the thing, and testing whether they're where they appear to be. Then he picked up this document. He read it with the methodical attention of a man who had learned never to take anything at face value and still occasionally found that face value was simply face value. He set it down. "The Southern Corridor," he said, "stays mine. And the non-aggression understanding covers both organizations' current associates. As listed in the appendix, Han will provide you with the full list within 48 hours." Choi looked at the document for one more moment. Then he looked up at Min-jae across the length of the table, and Min-jae held the look without moving, without the micro-adjustments of posture that men made when they were managing anxiety, because he was not managing anxiety right now. He was managing clarity, which was a different internal state entirely, and it felt, in his body, the way clarity always felt, cold and specific, and absolutely without room for anything that wasn't necessary. "I'll sign it," Choi said. The room exhaled without making a sound. The signing took 40 minutes. Copies for every representative, Han moving through the room with the quiet efficiency of a man who had prepared for precisely this and was not surprised by any of it. The family head signed as witnesses without resistance. Lim Byung-tae signed with the deliberateness of a man who was making a statement by the quality of his pen stroke. When it was done, the room began to empty in the way these rooms always emptied. Quickly, without ceremony, men with other things to do and no interest in extended formalities. The representatives left in pairs and threes. Choi Sung-ho left without looking at Min-jae again, which was not insult. It was the acknowledgement of a man who had gotten what he came for and had no remaining need from the transaction. Do-hyun was the last person Min-jae spoke to inside the warehouse. He had stayed against the wall through everything, and he looked, now, like a man who had run a very long distance and arrived somewhere he had not expected to arrive. Min-jae walked to him. "There's an account number Han will give you, enough to relocate, enough to start clean somewhere with different parameters." He held Do-hyun's gaze. "You're 26. That's not nothing." Do-hyun looked at him. His jaw worked for a moment. "I don't understand why you're doing that." "Because the money isn't mine anymore in any way that matters," Min-jae said, "and because you were in that room tonight when you didn't have to be. Those two facts together earn you a start." He paused. "What you do with it is no longer my business." Do-hyun looked at the floor, looked back up. "I was wrong about what I said, about her." He seemed to be working towards something and not finding the path. "About what you—" "I know," Min-jae said. He put his hand on Do-hyun's shoulder for a single second. Not warmth, not forgiveness, just acknowledgement. The recognition of a man who had made something and was reckoning honestly with what it had become. Then he walked out of the warehouse into the Incheon night. Han was outside, standing by the car, looking at his phone with the expression of a man who has executed a very complex thing and is already organizing what comes next. "It's done," Han said. "Is it clean?" "The signatures are solid. Every representative present. Choi will honor it. He got the zones, and he got them in a way that shows the council he can negotiate successfully. He has no reason to break it." Han put his phone away. "The Incheon territories are gone, Min-jae." "I know what's gone," Min-jae said. He stood in the parking lot and looked at the building behind him, the temporary lights still visible through the high windows. The table inside where 20 years of accumulated positioning had been laid down voluntarily in exchange for something that had no market value and could not be traded and could not be measured against territory. He breathed the cold air. His chest hurt in a way that was not physical. He let it. Then he got in the car. "Wonju," he said. Ryu pulled out of the lot and onto the Incheon Street, heading for the highway, heading north toward a house with a warm kitchen and a woman who had asked him not to get himself killed, and Min-jae sat in the back seat and pressed the heel of his hand against his sternum and breathed slowly and thought about how the things that cost the most were always the ones you hadn't put a number on until the moment came to pay. The highway opened up ahead, and the car accelerated into the dark, and somewhere in the building behind them, the warehouse lights were still burning over an empty table and a signed document that had ended 3 years of careful, strategic pressure in a single evening by the simple method of deciding what mattered more than winning and then being willing to say it out loud in a room full of men who understood exactly what it had cost. He closed his eyes. He did not sleep. But he let the road move under him and the city fall behind, and ahead of him somewhere in the dark was Wonju and a porch step and a woman who would be awake, because she was always awake when things were unresolved, and he was going to walk in and tell her it was done, and she was going to look at him with that careful, specific attention and decide, in the way she decided everything, what to do with what she saw. Ryu pulled into Jeonghye's gravel drive at 11:47 at night. The house had 2 lights on. The kitchen, which burned the way a kitchen burns when someone is awake inside it, doing something with their hands to keep the waiting manageable, and the upstairs window that Min-jae had identified on the first night as Amara's room, which was dark. She was asleep. He registered that with something that was not quite relief and not quite disappointment, the specific feeling of a man who has been moving toward something for hours and arrives to find the destination quiet. He did not go inside immediately. He sat in the car after Ryu cut the engine and looked at the house and breathed. His shoulders ached. The drive had been 3 hours, and he had spent most of it in the particular physical tension of a man whose body had not yet received the signal that the acute phase was over. The jaw tight, the hands not quite relaxed, even when there was nothing in them, the chest carrying the residual weight of a room full of men, and a decision that could not be undone. It was done. That was the fact. The signatures existed. The territories were gone. Choi Seung-ho was driving back to Seoul with what he had wanted for 3 years and no remaining strategic reason to position anyone outside a building in a coastal town. It was done, and doing it had cost exactly what he had known it would cost, and he was sitting in a dark car outside a house that didn't belong to him, trying to figure out what a man was supposed to feel when he had given up the thing he built his life on in exchange for the possibility, not the guarantee, the possibility, of being someone worth knowing. He got out of the car. Han called as he reached the porch steps. "Final confirmation," Han said. "Choi's people pulled out of Gosapo an hour ago. All surveillance assets, the sedans, the secondary vehicle, everyone. The town is clean. The coast house she had. Safe. Nothing there." Min-jae stood on the bottom porch step. "The documentation package for the family representatives. Going out by courier tomorrow morning. Complete chain, everything witnessed." A pause. "It holds, Min-jae. It's clean, and it holds." "Okay. Get some sleep." He ended the call. The kitchen light was on, and through the window he could see Jeonghye at the table with a mug and a book she wasn't reading, which meant she had been waiting, which meant she was going to look at him when he came in with the expression of a woman taking inventory of what had come back through her door. He went inside. She looked up. The inventory happened in about 3 seconds. "It's done," he said. She looked at him for a moment longer. "Sit down. I'll make tea." He sat at the kitchen table and she put the kettle on, and neither of them spoke for a minute, which was the right amount of not speaking. The kitchen was warm and smelled like the meal that had been cooked hours ago, and there was a dish draining by the sink that had 2 plates in it, and he thought about Amara eating dinner at this table and not knowing yet whether the evening in Incheon had gone the way it needed to go. "She didn't want to show that she was worried," Jeonghye said, setting a mug in front of him. "So she was very normal all evening. We watched something, I can't remember what. She went to bed at 10, and I heard her moving around until at least 11. He wrapped his hands around the mug. She's going to ask you for details tomorrow, Jung-hye said. She'll want to understand the full structure of what happened and whether it actually closes the exposure or just manages it. It closes it. I know. But she'll want to understand why, not just be told. Jung-hye sat down across from him with her own mug. She looked at him with the expression she had been wearing since he arrived 5 days ago. Not hostile now, not warm, simply assessing. You gave up the Incheon territories. Yes. Han told me when he called to confirm you were on your way back. She looked at her mug. I've known Amara for 6 years. I've watched her talk about you for 2 of them. Not always charitably, especially near the end. She knew something was wrong before she knew what it was. She looked back up. She's not going to give you what you want back just because you did the right thing tonight. I know that. I want to make sure you know it in the way that doesn't produce resentment later. Because men who make sacrifices often turn them into debts without meaning to. He looked at her. I'm not going to do that. How do you know? Because the thing I'm trying to earn isn't something she owes me. It's something she gets to decide. He held her gaze. Whether she decides it or not doesn't change what I did tonight. Those are separate. Jung-hye was quiet for a moment. She told me once, maybe a year into your marriage, that you were the most self-sufficient person she'd ever met, she said. She meant it as a problem. She said loving someone who doesn't need anything from you is like... She said it was like watering a plant through glass. You can see it, you can try, but nothing you do actually reaches it. She held her mug in both hands. I think she'll want to see whether that's changed. Not hear about it, see it. He said nothing. Go to sleep, she said. The kitchen chair again, or there's a cot in the back room. It's not comfortable, but it's horizontal. The back room, he said. He drank the tea, rinsed the mug, found the back room, which was being used for storage, and contained a folding cot that was exactly as uncomfortable as advertised, and he lay on it in his clothes and looked at the ceiling and was asleep in under 4 minutes, which was what exhaustion did when you finally gave it permission. He woke before 6. The house was still. He lay on the cot for a few minutes, running through the next sequence of necessary things, the courier, the Eastern family calls Han would need support on, the first steps of the Incheon transition that would begin within the week. There was a lot of work ahead. The kind of work that did not announce itself dramatically, but that required consistent, unglamorous presence over months and years. He got up and went to the kitchen and found the coffee, and he was standing at the counter when he heard footsteps on the stairs. Slow, measured. The footsteps of someone who had been awake for a while before deciding to come down. Amara appeared in the kitchen doorway. She was in the gray sweater and loose pants, hair loose, no clip. She looked at him at the counter with the coffee, and she looked at the back room door standing open, and she put those 2 things together, and her expression moved through something he couldn't fully read and came out the other side as neutral. You slept here, she said. Cot in the back. She moved to the kitchen table and sat down. He brought her a mug without asking, and she accepted it without comment, which was either progress or simply caffeine pragmatism, and he sat across from her. They looked at each other. Tell me, she said. He told her. All of it. Not the version edited for comfort, but the version that was accurate, including the parts where the execution had been improvised and the parts where the outcome had depended on Choi making the decision that was in his own best interest rather than the decision that was purely adversarial, and the parts where Min-jae had not been certain, going into the room, that the room would go the way it needed to. She listened without interrupting. Her hands were around the mug, and her eyes were on the table mostly, occasionally on his face, and she had the quality of someone who was doing active work while she listened, not just receiving but processing in real time, building her own structure of what had happened from the materials he was providing. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. The council challenge, she said. Choi had it already in motion. Yes. And calling the meeting first, your meeting, your room, that's what shifted the frame. The frame and the record. Everyone who might have received Choi's version of events heard mine first, directly, with documentation and Do-hyun physically present. He can't rewrite that now. He paused. The territories were real, but the meeting structure was what made the difference. She nodded slowly. And Do Hyun. He'll leave Korea. There's money enough to make a legitimate start somewhere. What he does with it? He stopped. I don't know what he does with it. He's 26, and he made a serious mistake, and he still has enough time for that to not be the defining thing about him if he decides it isn't. He looked at the table. I'm not confident he'll decide that, but I wanted to give him the conditions for it. Amara was quiet. She looked at her mug and then out the window at the gray early morning, the frost on the garden beds, the sky not yet decided on what kind of day it was going to be. That's different from what you would have done a year ago, she said. Yes. With someone who did what he did. Yes. She looked at him. What changed? He thought about giving her the clean version again. He did not. I stood outside your building in the dark for 31 minutes, he said, after I found the clinic record. I knew where you were, I knew the address, and I sat in the car and looked at your window and couldn't make myself knock because I had nothing to offer that was worth what you'd have to open the door to get. He looked at his hands. I've been in rooms with men who wanted to end my organization, my life, everything I've built. I've never been as stuck as I was sitting in that car. He paused. A man who can be that stuck by the prospect of knocking on a door is not the same man he was a year ago. Something is different. I don't have a clean story about when it changed, but it's different. Amara looked at him for a long moment. The careful, specific attention. He held still for it. Do you know what I thought about, she said, when I walked out of your office building that morning? He shook his head. I thought about the ferry. She looked at her mug. You remember, we took the ferry to Gangwado in the spring of the first year. You weren't supposed to have the day free, some meeting rescheduled, and you called me and said 3 hours. Do you want 3 hours? And we took the ferry and you fell asleep on the upper deck for 40 minutes in the sun. She paused. You never fell asleep places. You didn't do that. But you were asleep in about 3 minutes, and you had this... She stopped. Her jaw tightened briefly and then released. You looked like yourself. Whatever version of you exists when nothing is required of you. I sat there for 40 minutes watching the water and watching you sleep and thinking, this is the person I chose. This is who he actually is under all of it. The kitchen was very quiet. And when I walked out of the building, she said, that was the thing I thought about. Not the anger. The anger came later. I thought about the ferry, and I thought about how far the distance was between who you were asleep in the sun and who you were standing at that window. And I couldn't figure out which one was real. She looked at him. I'm still not completely sure. That's honest. I know, he said. The ferry one is real, she said. I believe that. I've believed it this whole time, even when I was furious at you, even when I was sitting in a hotel room in Mapo going through my accounts like a general planning a campaign. A breath. But real doesn't mean it's enough. Real doesn't mean you'll choose it. There's a version of you that has both of those people inside him and has spent 20 years consistently choosing the one that isn't on a ferry deck in the sun. He was quiet. I chose wrong, he said. Consistently. That's accurate. I'm not saying that to make you feel, I know you're not. He looked at her directly. You're saying it because it's true, and because the true version of it matters more to you than the comfortable version. I know the difference. He held her gaze. I chose wrong. I did it across 2 years and probably the 3 years before that, when I could have changed what I was building and didn't because I was comfortable and because I was good at what I was doing and I didn't look far enough ahead. He paused. There's nothing I can do about the past version of those choices. What I can affect is the choices that happen from here. Amara looked at him. Yes, she said, quietly. That's the thing. She looked back at her mug. The thing is, that's true. And also that I've spent 26 days on my own figuring out what I want my life to look like. And the version I arrived at is mine. It's not built around you. It's not built around this situation. It's something I built from scratch in a room above a fish market, and I need you to understand that whatever happens between us... She stopped, pressed her lips together. I'm not going back to being the woman who watered a plant through glass. I won't do it. Whatever we are or become, I need to be visible in it, actually visible. Not present as a function, not the warm thing waiting at home. You were never a function, he said. I was too self-sufficient to recognize what you were, which is different from treating you as a function, but not different enough. I know that. She looked at him for a moment. Jong-hye used that word, she said. Self-sufficient. She said it to me last night, too. She said you described it as watering a plant through glass. Amara's mouth curved. Not a full smile. Something smaller, less resolved, the expression of a person encountering an emotion they hadn't scheduled. She wasn't supposed to tell you that. She was making a point. She usually is. She looked at her mug. What do you want, Min-jae? Not what you think I need to hear. What do you actually want? He thought about giving her the careful version. He gave her the real one. I want to be at the table when she learns things, he said. Not watching from a distance, not showing up for the significant moments and disappearing for the ordinary ones. I want the ordinary ones. I want to be... He stopped. Found the words. I want to be the person she expects to see when she looks up. Not a visitor, not an event, the constant. He paused. And I want to find out whether there's a version of us that can exist after everything that's happened. I don't know if there is. I'm not asking you to decide that tonight, but I want it to be a question we're both still asking. The kitchen was very still. Outside, somewhere in the garden, a bird made a sound, brief, tentative, the way birds sounded before the day had fully committed to itself. I'm going to find a house, Amara said finally. Coastal, small. I told you that. I'm not changing it. She looked at him. But there's a room. In whatever house I find, there's a room. Not for you to live in. I need to be clear about that. For you to sleep in when you visit. So she has a place where both of her parents exist in the same space, even if they're not... She stopped. Even if that's all we are for a while. Min-jae said nothing for a moment. Is that what you want? He said. Or is that what you're constructing because it's practical for her? She looked at him, quick, sharp, the look of someone who has been accurately seen and is deciding whether to acknowledge it. Both, she said. Is that allowed? Yes, he said. That's allowed. She looked out the window again. The garden was lightening with the morning, and the frost on the beds was catching what pale sun there was and turning it into something briefly bright. There's a place in Sokcho I've been looking at online, she said. Small, 2 bedrooms, a garden that would need work, walking distance to the water. She paused. It's listed below what I budgeted, which probably means there's something wrong with it, but I want to go look at it when this is... She gestured, not quite at him, at the situation. When there's room to. I'll drive you, he said. She looked at him. Orhan can arrange... I'll drive you, she said. If the security situation is what you say it is. It is. Then you can drive me. She stood up and rinsed her mug. After we eat something. I haven't been eating breakfast and the clinic keeps telling me I need to eat breakfast. He stood. Sit down, she said without turning from the sink. I'll make it. You've probably been awake half the night. He sat back down. She moved around Jong-hye's kitchen with the ease of a woman who had spent 5 days learning where everything was and had made the space partially her own, the way she made spaces her own, incrementally, without announcement, until one day they simply reflected her. She found the eggs. She found the pan. She worked with the quiet competence of someone whose hands knew what they were doing and whose mind was somewhere else. And he watched her and thought about 40 minutes on a ferry deck and the particular quality of a face that looked like itself when nothing was required. He watched her and said nothing and let the ordinary minutes pass around them like water. Jong-hye came down at 7:30 and found them at the table eating eggs and looked at the two of them with an expression that assessed the situation and reached some conclusion she kept to herself. She poured coffee and sat at the end of the table, and the three of them ate without a great deal of talking, and it was not uncomfortable, which was its own kind of information. After breakfast, Min-jae went outside and called Han. The courier had gone out at 6. The Eastern family calls were scheduled for the afternoon. The Incheon transition team was in place. Everything that needed to be in motion was in motion. One more thing, Han said. Seo Ah. The name dropped into the morning air. She's in Busan, Han said. Settled into the reassignment. No contact attempts, no issues. A pause. She asked through the reassignment documentation whether her terms of employment were being reviewed. Her terms are unchanged, Min-jae said. She's an employee in a satellite office doing the work she was assigned. That's all. She'll interpret that as, I know what she'll interpret it as. That's accurate. He looked at the garden. The frost had melted now, and the beds were wet and bare, and looked like something that had survived winter and was waiting to be told what to become. She made a choice about what our professional relationship was going to include. The consequences of that choice are what they are. I'm not managing her interpretation of them. Understood. He ended the call. He stood in the garden for a moment, alone. He thought about Seo in a way he had not yet allowed himself to think about her since the conference room. Not with anger. The anger had been real and had done its work and was mostly spent. With the specific discomfort of a man reckoning honestly with his own participation in a situation he had spent weeks framing as something that happened to him. He had not been passive. He had made choices. He had stood at a window and made a set of choices that had a name and a nature, and he could track the consequences of those choices across everything that had happened since, including a woman carrying a gift bag who had stood in a hallway and made no sound. He had also stood in an Incheon warehouse last night and made a different set of choices. He was trying to determine whether those two things existed in the same man and what it meant that they did. He thought they did. He thought that was probably the most honest thing he could say about himself, that both of those people lived in him, and the question of his life going forward was which one made the decisions. He went back inside. What? They drove to Sokcho 2 days later. The security situation was what Min-jae had said it was. Clean, no surveillance, Choi's organization fully retracted. Han confirmed it the morning they left, and Min-jae relayed the confirmation to Amara, who absorbed it with a nod that said she had already decided to trust it and was simply noting the confirmation. The drive was 3 hours. Amara sat in the passenger seat and looked out the window at the landscape moving, and they talked intermittently about things that were not the situation. A documentary she'd been watching on Jung Hye's laptop, a conversation she'd had with Maya about moving back to Korea, which was not decided and probably wouldn't be for a while. The question of what it meant to build a garden from scratch when you didn't know yet what would grow. He did not fill the silences. He had spent 20 years filling silences with the forward motion of the next necessary thing, and he was learning, not easily, not without conscious effort, that some silences were not gaps to be managed, but simply the space between people doing their thinking. The house in Sokcho was on a narrow street 3 blocks from the sea. It was small. The garden was overgrown in the specific way of a space that had been enthusiastically planted and then not maintained, vines in places they hadn't been intended, beds lost under volunteers and weeds. The fence needed work. One of the window frames in the back room was swollen and wouldn't close completely, which was the thing wrong with it that the listing price reflected. Amara walked through it in the particular way she walked through spaces she was serious about, not quickly, not looking at everything, but stopping in each room and standing still for a moment, which he recognized as her taking the measure of whether she could be herself in the space. The kitchen was bigger than it looked from the listing. She stood in it for almost 2 minutes. The back bedroom looked out over the garden. She stood at the window of that room for a long time. He stood in the doorway and did not ask what she was thinking. Eventually she said, "The garden would take about a year to fix properly." "Probably. The window frame is a 2-hour job, 3 if the wood is worse than it looks." "Yes." She turned from the window. "Do you know how to fix a window frame?" "No." "I didn't think so." She looked at the room. "I'll hire someone." She looked at the window again. "There's a room off the kitchen that would work, for the cot situation." He said nothing. "If you're going to drive 3 hours to see her," she said, still looking at the window, "you should have somewhere to sleep that isn't 3 hours back." He said, "Yes." She turned and walked past him out of the room, brushing his arm as she went. Not deliberate, not an accident, simply the ordinary proximity of 2 people moving through a small doorway. And it was the most ordinary thing that had happened between them in weeks, and it cost him something he hadn't expected to pay. She called the listing agent from the front garden. He He walked to the fence and looked at it and thought about what would need to happen to it. Post-work, probably. The wood was soft in a couple of places. He did not know how to fix a fence any more than he knew how to fix a window frame. He thought he could probably learn. Behind him, he could hear her on the phone, her voice professional and specific, asking the right questions in the way she asked all questions, directly, without preamble, the warm-hearted woman from Chicago who had moved across the world and learned to move through rooms without being seen, and was done with that now. She signed the lease 3 weeks later. The movers brought what little she had accumulated, the things from storage in Seoul that were legally hers, the things she'd bought in the month since Gosapo, a crib that her sister Maya had shipped from Chicago in a box so large it had required 2 people just to move it from the door. Min-jae drove down on moving day because she had asked him to, and he moved boxes for 6 hours and did not complain about his back, which hurt, and ate the takeout she ordered sitting on the floor of the kitchen because there were no chairs yet. And at the end of the day, when everything that was going to be in place was in place, he sat in the garden in the late afternoon light and looked at what was going to need work and felt the specific, unfamiliar feeling of a man with somewhere to come back to that he hadn't built himself. The months after that were not quick and were not dramatic. They were the months of becoming someone different in the small ways that actual change required. The daily ones, the undramatic ones, the ones that didn't feel like transformation while they were happening, but that accumulated into something visible from a distance. He drove to Socho every 2 weeks, sometimes more. He slept in the room off the kitchen on a proper bed that Amara had found secondhand and had reframed the description of, the guest room she called it, consistently, which he did not debate. He fixed the fence on the 4th visit badly, and Han's driver, who had come down with him, looked at it and said nothing, which was its own kind of review. He hired someone to fix it properly the following week and was present for the work, watching with the specific attention of a man who intended to learn something from the watching. The garden was, as predicted, a year's work. Amara had started on the beds nearest the kitchen window first. He helped when she asked and stayed out of it when she didn't, and there was a particular satisfaction in the ones he worked on, not because he was good at it, because he wasn't, but because the garden required presence and patience and gave back in proportion to both, which was a lesson he was finding applicable in contexts well beyond soil. In Seoul, the organizational restructuring moved forward in the grinding, unglamorous way that large-scale change always moved. 2 more illegal operations wound down, a legitimate trading company acquired through a clean purchase. Han managed the operational transition with the same efficiency he brought to everything, and a patience for the slower margins of legitimate business that surprised Min-jae, who had expected resistance. "It's not harder," Han said once, reviewing a quarterly report in the Seoul office. "Just slower. The speed was always the part I liked least anyway." Min-jae looked at him. "You never told me that." "You never would have heard it." Han did not look up from the report. "You would have heard it as a preference I could manage, not as information about the structure." He was right, and Min-jae said nothing. The Eastern family relationship stabilized over the 3rd and 4th months. Lim Byung-tae made a call in month 4 that was, in the specific language of these relationships, the equivalent of shaking hands, an invitation to a dinner that served no strategic purpose except to signal that a line had been drawn under the question of Min-jae's standing. Min-jae accepted and brought Han and ate the dinner and said little and listened more and drove home thinking that 20 years ago he had understood that kind of room completely, and now it felt like a room he was visiting rather than inhabiting. He thought that was probably correct, and that correct was better than comfortable. Amara went into labor on a Thursday morning in January, exactly 6 months after the morning he'd driven south to stand outside her building in Gosapo. She called him herself, which he had not anticipated, and her voice on the phone was controlled and focused and entirely characteristic. "It started. You don't need to rush. There's time. But come now." Which was the most Amara sentence he had ever heard her say, and he was in the car 4 minutes after the call ended. He drove 3 hours in weather that could not decide between rain and sleet, and his hands were steady on the wheel and his mind was not, which was the reverse of every other crisis he had driven toward in his life. Han called at the 2-hour mark. "Are you there yet?" he said. "Hour out?" Drive carefully. Han. Yes. Thank you for the past 6 months, all of it. A pause, the kind Han rarely allowed. Drive carefully, he said again, and ended the call. The hospital was in Sokcho. She had registered there in her 5th month, a clinic she had chosen herself, a doctor she had decided she trusted after 2 appointments. Min-jae arrived at 12:40 and found her room on the 3rd floor and stood in the doorway for a second before going in. Amara was in the bed. Maya on her left. She had flown from Chicago 4 days ago, which meant Amara had known and had not told him she was coming, which was her right, and which he absorbed without making it a thing. Jong-hye was on the right, having driven from Wonju at 6 in the morning. The room had the particular quality of a space already organized around a central purpose. 3 women, each present and necessary, the air between them carrying years of a friendship that had held through things he had been part of causing. Amara looked at him when he came in. She was in the middle of something. A contraction, he understood from the quality of her stillness, the way she was holding her breath and releasing it in the controlled, measured way he had seen her use twice in the past 6 months when something required management. Her eyes found him and registered his presence and then went back to the middle distance and the breath work. He went to the chair in the corner. Maya looked at him with the steady, unreadable gaze of a woman who knew everything and was deciding in real time what she thought about the man it had happened with. He met her eyes directly and held them, which was all he could offer, and she nodded once, fractional, assessing, and turned back to her sister. He sat in the corner. He stayed in the corner when Jong-hye brought water. He stayed when the midwife came in and did what midwives did, and spoke to Amara in the focused, specific language of someone guiding a body through something ancient. He stayed when the hours moved through the afternoon and into the evening, each one different from the last. The labor was not the clean, steady progression the books described, but the real version, uneven and relentless, with patches of awful stillness and then sudden forward motion, and Amara in the center of it doing the most extraordinary, ordinary thing that human beings did. He was not needed in the corner. He stayed in the corner anyway. He stayed because she had asked him to be there, and staying was what being there required. And he had spent enough of his life confusing presence with management, arriving in rooms and making them organize around himself, and he did not want to do that here. Not in this room. He wanted to take up exactly the space he was asked to take up, and no more. At 4:15 in the afternoon, Amara looked across the room at him during a gap between contractions. "You okay?" she said. He looked at her. The exhaustion on her face, the extraordinary, unsentimental focus of a woman doing something that required everything, looking across a room to check on the person sitting in the corner. "Yes," he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. She held his gaze for a second. Then the next contraction came, and her attention went back to where it needed to be. At 7:41 in the evening, their daughter was born. He heard her before he saw her. The immediate, furious announcement of a person arriving and finding the new environment unacceptable. And then Amar's laugh, sudden and unguarded, the laugh of a woman who has just met someone and immediately recognized them. Maya was crying. Jong-hye had both hands pressed to her mouth. The midwife was moving with the brisk efficiency of someone who loved their work. Min-jae stood up from the chair. He stood because sitting no longer fit what was happening in the room. He stood and gripped the back of the chair with one hand and looked at what was happening 20 feet away and felt the specific feeling of something too large for the architecture of his chest trying to find room. The midwife brought her to him. He had not asked. He looked at Amara in the bed and she was looking at him, and she said something to the midwife, a quiet, specific direction, and the midwife carried his daughter across the room and placed her in his arms. She weighed nothing and everything. She weighed the specific weight of the only thing he had ever held that he did not know how to be careful enough with, and his hands adjusted and readjusted without him directing them, finding the right angle, the right support. And she looked up at him with the unfocused intensity of someone for whom the world was entirely new, and he was one of its first features. She had Amara's jaw. Her nose was undecided. Around her eyes was something that belonged to neither of them, something entirely new, entirely hers, that he had never seen before and would spend years learning the expressions of. Her hands were the size of half his thumb, and they were moving. He stood in that room holding his daughter, and his hands were not steady, and he made no effort to make them steady because steadiness was not what this required. "Hey," he said. His voice was almost nothing. She blinked. He stood there for a long time. Later, when the room had settled into its quieter version, Maya gone for food, Jong-hye standing in the hallway, giving them the privacy her instincts had always known when to offer, Min-jae brought the baby back to Amara and sat in the chair beside the bed. She had her daughter against her chest, and her eyes were half closed with the total exhaustion of someone who had given everything and arrived somewhere on the other side of it. They sat without speaking for a while. "Sua," Amara said eventually. Her voice was soft and rough at once. He looked at her. "Her name. I've had it for a while." She looked down at the sleeping face against her chest. "Long life, clear and bright. It works in both languages, and my mother's name had something close in it." She looked up. "Is that—" "It's right," he said. She looked back at Sua. "I know." The room was quiet and warm. Outside the window, the January dark was complete and cold and indifferent in the way winter nights were. And inside this room there was a child breathing the first hours of her life, with the small, absolute certainty of someone who had arrived and intended to stay. "Min-jae," Amar said. "Yeah." She was quiet for a moment, choosing. "What you gave up," she said. "The territories, the meeting, the—" She stopped. Started again. "I've been carrying something since you came back from Incheon, and I need to put it down." She kept her eyes on Sua. "I see what it cost. I want you to know that I see it. Not what it buys you. I'm not saying it buys you anything, but the cost of it is real, and I see it, and that matters to me." She paused. "That's all. I just needed to say that." He looked at his daughter sleeping against her mother's chest. "I know what I lost," he said. "I know the number, and I know the history of it, and I know what it took to get there." He paused. "I also know that I sat outside a building in Gosapo for 31 minutes, unable to knock on a door, and that told me something about what the number was worth compared to what was on the other side of the door." He paused again. "I don't want credit for doing the math right finally. I just want to keep doing it right from here." Amar looked at him. The look lasted long enough to be a decision. "Okay," she said. "Not forgiveness, not a return. Something realer than either. The word of a woman who had weighed what she saw against what she knew and arrived at something she was willing to build on." "There's a breakfast place 3 blocks from the house," she said. "By the sea. They open at 7. She's going to need to meet it eventually." He said, "I'll make a reservation." "You can't make a reservation at a breakfast place." "I'll find a way." She looked at him, and this time the thing at the corner of her mouth did not stop before it became a smile. Small, specific, the particular smile of a woman who knows exactly how absurd something is and finds that the absurdity is not, after everything, intolerable. "Go to sleep," she said. "There's a chair that folds out." "I'm not tired." "You've been awake for 20 hours and you drove 3 hours in sleep." "I'm not tired," he said again. "Let me have this." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at Sua, and he looked at Sua, and the 3 of them inhabited the warm January room together, while outside the winter dark pressed against the window, and inside the only sound was the small certain breathing of a person who had just arrived and had no knowledge yet of what had been broken and rebuilt to bring her here. He did not sleep. He sat in the chair beside the bed and watched his daughter breathe and thought about a fairy deck in the spring and 40 minutes in the sun and the version of himself that had existed in that sleep, unguarded and entirely real, and he thought that version had not disappeared. It had only been buried under 20 years of other choices, and that what was possible, going forward, was not a return to something lost, but the slow and unglamorous work of choosing differently, one ordinary day at a time, until the shape of a life accumulated around those choices into something that a child could grow up inside without needing to understand its history to feel its safety. Sua Kang slept. Her father watched. Her mother slept too, finally, the deep earned sleep of someone who had done the hardest thing and arrived at the other side. and the room was quiet and warm, and Min Jae sat in the folding chair with his elbows on his knees and his hands loosely clasped and let the night pass around him without trying to move through it faster than it moved. He had spent his life moving fast. He had built an empire on the speed of his decisions and the efficiency of his response and the ability to be 3 steps ahead of every room he entered. His daughter breathed. His wife slept. He sat still. Outside, the January dark was beginning, at its very edge, to consider becoming something else. And Min Jae Kang, former empire builder, man who had laughed when he should have defended, man who had sat outside a door for 31 minutes counting his own failures, man who had signed away 12 years of territory in a warehouse for the right to sit in this chair, watched the window and waited for the morning with the specific patience of someone who had finally, at great cost, learned that the most important things did not reward hurry. They rewarded showing up. He was here. He intended to keep being here. That was enough for tonight, and tonight was what he had.